And Rachel, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel King. I'm thrilled to be with you. I was telling folks in the waiting room before we came together that Sloan is a tough act to follow. If you all joined that session, I've heard her speak before, and she's really incredible. And my mind is just running with all sorts of things from that last session. So maybe we'll be able to make some connections between what's coming up for you and your desire to use restorative justice on campus. So again, tell you a little bit about myself and kind of how I come to this work. And I've asked you to put your hellos to each other in the chat if you'd like, to give each other a chance to hear where you're coming from and what your role is maybe on campus. So I will invite you to be very active in the chat. Go for it if you would like. I love your comments and your thoughts as we go. And if you're just here to kind of take it all in, that's great too. So I am a restorative justice practitioner who has been working mostly around sexual harm cases for the past decade or so, but I've been an RJ practitioner for 20 years now. I moved out to Colorado in 2004 and found restorative justice while working in a student conduct role, which is a primary focus that I had for about a decade, overseeing all sorts of student misconduct cases and chairing behavioral intervention teams and bias incident response, and then moved back to Massachusetts, where I am now and where I'm from originally, and did that work, very similar work, for another decade or so on a much smaller campus. So I've worked on lots of different kinds of campuses, and now my primary role is really just supporting schools all over the country to look at how we can embed restorative justice into our responses to identity-based harm, particularly around sexual violence and sexual harassment. So I'm thrilled to be with you, and I'm really loving this conference and the conversations that we've been having so far. So I hope, like I said, that you'll continue to share thoughts with me in the chat as we go and with each other. So that's a little bit about how I come to this work. I want to add to my location a land acknowledgement that I am coming to you from the tribal homeland of the Nipmuc Nation, and that given the indigenous roots of these practices that we're going to be talking about, it feels particularly important to recognize not only the Nipmuc Nation, but also the neighboring Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and Wampanoag people where I'm located in Massachusetts. So thank you for letting me share that. And we'll talk a lot more about these practices, their origins, and how we navigate attention as we talk about challenges that you might encounter. One of which can be that these practices are really designed to be communities coming together, resolving their own harm, as opposed to going to an outside entity or bringing it to a system or a third party to decide what happens. So what do we do when we work within systems? And I am an active volunteer with a criminal referral program, taking law enforcement referrals to divert these cases. And I'm working in campuses that have those systems. So I'm really frequently sitting with that tension. What does that mean for us to do this work in ways that don't constitute appropriation, but really appreciate the roots and recognize the problems with our traditional responses? My assumption is that you have chosen this session because you have an understanding already of what restorative justice is. So this is definitely not an RJ 101. I do want to talk about a couple slides of what I mean by restorative justice for sexual harm. What are we seeing in terms of how it's being used on campuses? What's the framework from which I come to my work of specifically conferencing, typically when I'm working with schools? And then we're going to talk about what do we mean by buy-in. So I'm really excited and hopeful to hear from you a little bit when we get to that piece. Who are the folks that you're hoping to get their buy-in? What does that look like? And what are the primary concerns or hesitations and hurdles that you're encountering? And then I'll share the ones that I see that are most common, but I really want to hear from you as well. And then I hope to give you really concrete strategies for responding to pushback, including literally what I might say when people raise those different hesitations, and then really specific strategies for growing support. So, were you to do, for example, we'll talk about the idea of an overview session for your campus. I'll give you what I would cover in that overview session. So, I want you to walk away feeling like you really have some practical pieces to try to expand the use of restorative justice in your community, recognizing that some of you probably already have a process in place and you would like to see people access it. Others might feel like, I'd love to see us do this, but we actually don't yet. And so the last piece here is, what does it look like to build that community partnership so that you're not going at it alone to try to make this happen? And who could you be partnering with and how? So again, hopefully some really practical strategies for doing that. I mentioned that I am going to ask you to put things into the chat often, and I welcome and appreciate you doing so. The first thing that I would love to ask of you before I dive in is that exact piece about how many folks are coming at this from a campus where it is already an option within your maybe informal or adaptable resolution pathway for Title IX cases or sexual misconduct cases, or how many folks don't even have this as an option on campus and you'd like to see it used in that way. So I'm going to make sure that I am in my Whova chat and getting a sense of where you're coming from. So you can do it as, thank you, Nora. We have limited RJ options. We have adaptive resolution. Thanks, Jessica. So just give me a sense of whether this is something that you're here really hoping to see it expanded or introduced. Thanks, Louise. Yeah, this is great. So as you do that, I'm going to pull up a definition to try to get us all kind of on the same page of what I mean by restorative justice. And again, I have like 4 or 5 slides to just get a basic understanding, and then we'll move right into some of those barriers and buy-in pieces. I'm looking at the chat and see this idea of options in name only, and working on building it out. Great. Thank you. That's super helpful. Okay, so when we think about restorative justice, it really does not have a singular definition. It is widely considered a movement or a lens through which we look at harm and how we respond to that harm. And so I love Howard Zer's definition, which many of you are probably familiar with, because I think it really centers this idea that it is a process, and it may be any number of different types of processes, like we'll talk about, but that it's designed to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in an offense and to allow them to really collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations with those goals of healing and putting things as right as possible. And so, what that means in any given situation could be very different from another situation. A restorative process may involve friends who felt really impacted and have a stake in an offense, or an entire team who's been impacted by something that happened, versus you may have other situations where you're not involving anyone other than the 2 directly involved individuals. And so as we think about what does it mean to have a stake in an offense, I find this definition really helps me think of what kind of process is needed here, who might we include. And then I love the distinction between harms, needs, and obligations, because we often hear and see this idea of what the harm was for someone without really more deeply understanding what the need is that it created for them and what it could look like to try to meet that need. So I won't go into more depth about that definition, but I will say that the way at which I come at restorative practice is through the lens of what we refer to as the restorative triangle. And I find it really essential in this work because you'll see that at the top it has the responsible party. On the bottom, you'll see harmed party, but then it also has community. And when we think about our traditional response systems, they really disempower all 3 points on this triangle, right? Because the responsible party doesn't really have say over the outcome. The harmed party doesn't have say. They might give like a victim impact statement, but they're not really deciding what happens. And certainly community is not often weighing in on that outcome or having a lot of control. So, in a restorative lens, these 3 points on the triangle have equal control over the outcome. And what we see is the use of a neutral, or rather, this idea of a multi partial facilitator. You can almost picture them as at the center of the triangle. And so they don't decide the outcome. You'll see some parallels to mediation, and we'll distinguish in what ways restorative justice is like mediation and how that can be helpful in explaining it to people, and in what ways it's actually quite different, in particular the model that I'll be talking about for those who have concerns that we would be proposing mediation for certain types of harm. And so this multi-partial facilitator, their job is to care equally about all 3 points on the triangle and to help figure out that way to move forward, whether it's a restorative agreement or facilitating dialogue. And it may not be that they're ever physically bringing parties together, but sometimes it may be that they're creating a space for direct facilitated dialogue. And the last thing that I'll say about the restorative triangle before we move on to just, I think, one or two more slides about kind of the key principles of any restorative process is that the triangle is this super helpful visual. I literally have, I will show you a rock that I use because that I found intentionally that is a triangle, because I so often am going like this. I'm always talking about these 3 points on the triangle. And I figured rather than just holding up my fingers, I would get a cool rock triangle. And the idea is that each line on the triangle represents a relationship that's damaged when an incident occurs. And so restorative justice practices can be really valuable for helping to think very intentionally about those discrete relationships. And it distinguishes this from what we might think of as like just a victim offender dialogue or victim offender mediation, because we're not just asking the two parties to figure out what needs to happen to move forward. We're really thinking often about including a representative from the institution whose responsibility it is to meet community safety considerations. We're including them in a way that they are weighing in, and that may also start to get at concern that folks may have, which is, are we giving up power over the outcome? Are we giving up control if we allow folks to identify their own agreement and path forward, when in fact it's really important that the community is an active participant? And again, that could be an administrator who's not the same person facilitating and controlling that outcome, because the facilitator does not control the outcome, rather. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing in the voice of community to address safety concerns that are not the responsibility of the survivor, nor do they necessarily have the knowledge or resources to know what to put in place. Even if they wanted to prevent this from happening to someone else, they don't bring that expertise. And I just often think it's really important that we're not putting that responsibility on them to prevent this from happening to someone else, when the community may feel that responsibility, and frankly does and should on our campuses. So that's a little bit about the restorative triangle. I would not be surprised if I come back to it again, because I think it's such a helpful model and lens through which we look at how we can be using restorative justice. I guess the only other thing I want to be clear about is that when we talk about those relationships being damaged and repairing them, it's not to suggest that there's any obligation for a harmed party to be in relationship with someone who has harmed them, but rather it's centered around this concept of being in right relationship, meaning what could responsible party do to make things right to the extent possible, so that this person, this harmed person, feels better about them either being on campus or just being in the world, even if they are no longer allowed or choosing to be on campus. So pop those questions in the chat as they're coming up for you, and I'm going to start to talk about some different ways in which we see this used. And maybe what I'll do is ask Bridget to just keep an eye on the Q&A in the chat, and if anyone has questions, just ping me in the Zoom chat and I'll take a look.
No
So
problem.
Yeah, thanks. We see this used in lots of different ways. And some of you who are saying, we have this in policy or we offer this approach, but it's not necessarily robust. You may see elements on here of ways in which it is infused into your process. And there may be other things on here that you say, we don't do that. And the first is direct communication or facilitated dialogue between parties. And so, even when we're using what I would consider like a conferencing model or a restorative circle process, is another thing you'll see up there. Sometimes both parties are a part of that process, and that facilitated dialogue may be even just the two of them with a facilitator. It may be them along with support people, but there may be other times in which they're not both participating. And that's where we start to think about how can we be using circle processes and conferencing, even when they're not both present, to co-construct a resolution or address issues that arose in the incident, meaning we may have a vicarious victim. We may see things like circles of support and accountability. We may see that there is a need for survivor support and use circle processes where a survivor is coming together with other survivors and or campus community members to support them, but they're not necessarily sitting down directly with the person who harmed them. Another option, that third one up there that many schools use, is to engage in shuttle facilitation or this kind of collaborative resolution process, meaning that a facilitator who still doesn't have any control over the outcome meets with the parties separately to help them not just come up with an agreement, which is the next item on there, but also sometimes to get questions answered. So that shuttle facilitation can be more than just creating a resolution agreement. It can also be a way through which parties get additional needs met that come up for them as a result of what happened. And lastly, there are schools that are using this restorative approach in things like psychoeducation or in various workshops, or even infusing it as if you were in the session earlier today about the STARSA model. There's a lot of overlap in the way in which we approach harm repair through this restorative lens and pair individuals who cause harm with appropriate intervention, whether that's an assessment or treatment or psychoeducation. And so it often may be that an outcome of a restorative process is pairing both a harmed party with the appropriate resources and support, but also creating an agreement where an individual who's responsible has items they have to carry out, because a resolution agreement would not require anything ever of a harmed party, or a complainant is the language our policies might use. But it could be that a resolution is reached that requires, through voluntary commitment to participate in certain things, that requires that responsible party to engage in certain activities. There are five really kind of tenets of a restorative practice. And this is where I think people may feel that they infuse them into their practice. And I want to kind of debunk the idea that we're not doing RJ unless we're physically bringing parties together, because in fact, many students don't want to sit down with the person who has hurt them. And there are ways in which we can be restorative by hearing what a survivor wants and needs and really leading with these commitments or values. And they center around the idea that we prioritize relationships over rules. And so sometimes individuals wish to engage in a restorative process because they're less focused on whether or not someone is found in violation of the policy, and rather that they, as a human, have been hurt through this process and want to see things made right. They are processes that really hinge on respect for all people and respect for kind of our shared humanity, in the sense that we balance this idea of not necessarily needing to equate supporting a person with supporting the behavior they engaged in. And so by separating the two, we can have respect for the person and still almost invite them into the next one up there, which is their own responsibility. And I think there are a lot of questions that come up about what happens if someone's not fully accepting responsibility. So I will curb that. And if that's something folks want to talk more about, we certainly can. I think that's a common concern as well about what if someone is engaging in this behavior either for what's perceived as the wrong reasons or they're minimizing their conduct. What does that mean for their ability to participate? Then you'll see repair. These processes are really designed to provide people with an opportunity to make things right to the extent possible. And that triangle also, I think, is a really good reminder that when those relationships with community are damaged, as they are, including for the harmed party, that there's an opportunity to repair their relationship with their community that can't necessarily be impacted or achieved by the person who caused harm. There are really these kind of three independent relationships that warrant attention, and a restorative process allows us to think about not just what was the harm, but there's a question that Howard Zehr poses that many of you may be familiar with, which is this idea of whose obligation is this repair? And so when we focus on the repair, many people, other than the individual who caused the harm directly already are assuming a lot of responsibility to make things right because you're providing supportive measures. You're putting in place safety measures. You're perhaps helping the individual who engaged in the behavior to not do it again. And all of those pieces are a form of repair. And lastly, you'll see reintegration up there. This is primarily associated with the idea of creating opportunities for the person who has caused the harm to reintegrate into a community, whether it's yours, whether it's the same way that they were, or in a completely different way, in a way that positions them to be healthy. But I also think there's a lot of transferability to how we think about reintegration for those who are harmed because that relationship with community is damaged as well. And we know how often folks can experience social and reputational or all sorts of undeserved repercussions of being hurt. That secondary trauma can be just as significant or more. And so what do we need to do to support those individuals where reintegration may be needed? Another way to frame this is if those 5 R's are kind of the values, these are really the values in action. So when we apply a restorative approach, we prioritize being relational. We address harms, needs, and obligations. We use processes that are collaborative, so the parties are directly determining outcomes and weighing in on needs. And then our process as a whole has equal concern for the parties. So I think those folks that are accustomed to that sort of victim-centered language can struggle sometimes with this idea of what it means to have equal concern for parties. And in fact, what I sometimes say to help conceptualize that is that we center the harm. And so when we start with a harmed party's harm and their needs, we also recognize that there may be ways in which people need to show up for those who cause the harm in order to prevent it from happening again or in order to get those needs met for the individual who's been victimized. Okay, I want to pause there and just see any questions coming up for anyone. And I'm going to ask you to put something in the chat now as we start to talk about campus buy-in.
There are currently no questions.
I see that. All right, I'm going to see who's still with us and ask, even though it's already late in the day, see if you can remember, what did you have for breakfast? Let me give you 1 minute to put into the chat. What did you have for breakfast? Ooh, yum. I too had coffee. Oh, you're so good. Thanks. This is what I needed. It's hard on Zoom to just know who's still there. I love that someone had a sausage egg McGriddle. That's amazing. Okay. Yay. Thank you. So as you now make yourselves and me hungry, let's talk buy-in for a minute. So when we think about campus buy-in, there are a few pieces that I want to talk about. I want to talk about who are the individuals that you're trying to get them to buy in, and then who are the general communities. What do we mean? What are the various levels or means of buying in? Everything from approval for processes through the pipeline of students feeling they can access this. What do we mean by buy-in? And then what are their concerns and what are the needs that might be underlying those concerns that we can think about how to help meet those needs and maybe make implementation of a restorative practice or restorative process mutually beneficial. So let's start with who. Who are we talking about? If you would be so kind, put into the chat when you think about buy-in, whose buy-in are you thinking about generally? And if you don't want to speak to your campus, you can speak in general about campuses. Whose buy-in do you think is important? Title IX, yes, totally. Title IX, conduct, survivor, student affairs, conduct, upper administration, lawyers, yes. Who else? Community standards. Excellent. Okay, great. So a lot of this, I'm guessing, it is kind of, and then we'll move to this next piece of what does that buy-in look like. But with the exception of students, it's probably likely approval in some ways, right? So when we think about whose buy-in we need, the way in which they need to buy in will look very different. I love this reference also to like local RJ initiatives and groups because there's great opportunity to partner if the buy-in is there that it can be used in these ways, right? So here are just some of the ways in which we will talk about whose buy-in we worry about or need to tend to sometimes. So you all said students. I would say within that subset of survivors, and they're obviously staff and faculty and administrator survivors as well. Administration seems to me like one of the biggest ones that you're putting in the chat in terms of, um, student affairs folks and conduct folks. But the distinction that I want to make, and I welcome again more thoughts in the chat if they're coming up for you, is also between the staff who are involved in the process, who have to buy in because it would alter their day-to-day work, versus the staff or even administration who would be uninvolved, but really are more hesitant because of kind of philosophical concerns or what they might perceive as implementation concerns, but not because their day-to-day work would be impacted, which is a very different need and barrier than those staff members who are directly involved in responding to these cases. No one said this, I don't think, but I think just sort of the community perception or public at large, I sometimes call this kind of our PR element of perception. How do we get buy-in just broadly from outside folks about what this is? And that includes parents, those whose students may be impacted because they have been harmed, or those who may cause harm, or those who just generally have perceptions of what this is. That could extend to alumni. I don't even have on here, specific groups that we'll talk more about, like athletics or Greek life. But I also have advocacy, and I'm not sure if anyone put that in the chat, but I think our counseling centers, our confidential resources, and our survivor advocates, is it a matter of making sure that they understand what this is and isn't, and that there really need to be such key distinctions between when it's used and when it isn't. So there's a real piece here that we'll unpack around when it's appropriate. What does that mean to be appropriate? And then I'm seeing your question, Bailey, is buy-in the support from specific groups? Yeah, that's my question to you all, is when you think about buy-in, what is it that you are most in need of in order to further this work? And so the next ones up there are like really high level roles on campus, like your board, like legal counsel. I know someone said lawyers. So I think that's actually twofold. I trust that lawyers can also mean advisors to the students involved so that they understand what this is and isn't and can advise students on whether it's the right fit. And then, like Samantha said, general counsel, in-house legal counsel, how we can make sure that they know what this is and isn't, because there are some real liability and compliance considerations that we can unpack as well. not enough staff. I see Barbara saying too, like staff who are trained in RJ, and the investment in training staff is the pushback that you receive for sure. So that's kind of our next piece is what does that pushback look like? And I put faculty up here too. I think faculty can be such a powerful resource on campus, and that power can be wielded for better or for worse. They can, if they have a lot of institutional power and don't support what you're doing, it could be a barrier. And I've certainly worked in environments where faculty are discouraging students to come forward because of their perception of the process. And other times they could be a real asset to helping people understand what this is and isn't. So, what type of resistance and what concerns are we really talking about combating? So, I have a long list, but I want to start again with you and ask, it sounds like, as Barbara is saying, not having the staff trained in and of itself can be a form of resistance. What else do you see as hurdles to making this happen or to getting buy-in? What are we really up against here? And I'll give you a minute to put thoughts in the chat. Capacity, confidentiality, and liability. I'm going to write those down. They're all embedded in everything we're going to talk about, but I will write them down because we will literally talk about capacity, confidentiality. I appreciate. I want to come back to that one a little bit, and liability. What else for folks? Does that sort of hit the nail on the head for a lot of people? Yes, thank you. I think that what's interesting is that no one is really naming, although perhaps it's in liability and that might be kind of based on perception. But really, there are almost two different ways to think about the barriers. One is philosophical, some of which is based on misinformation and not understanding what restorative justice is or should be. And some of it, I often say, is based on very legitimate, crucial considerations that we should be thinking about, not because they don't understand it, but because the things that they're worried about are legitimate and important to be safeguarded through our process. I see other comments here like holding space for the gray and time for being creative. I definitely think time, the next section you'll see are those logistical considerations, perceptions around the logistical implications. So, how long would this take? What is the cost? And some of those include what's in our policy or what is the law? How does that impact what we can and can't do? How is this an additional time commitment in terms of training versus does this take a long time? And how do we push back on that perception that maybe this is more time consuming than what people might think is an alternative? And just resources. You all saying, I don't know that we have the staff to do this, that we don't have the training, or we may not know how to access the resources that we need, or we may not have the funding to engage in the level of support for the process that we need. Jessica put in here also the idea versus of formal sanctions versus something different feeling. 100%. So often the outcomes of a restorative process may look a lot like what someone could receive as sanctions, but there are some considerable key differences in how we get to even a similar looking resolution or items that need to be completed, even if they look similar to what might be put in place. There either are some key differences, including what constitutes a disciplinary record or a finding of responsibility and what doesn't, and also just that perception of what we mean by sanctions versus someone agreeing to do things. So maybe that's coming out in the following ways. It may be that you're hearing fears like survivors would be pressured into participating, or a fear that RJ would lack accountability. Maybe it's power dynamics, and there are concerns that the process would be imbalanced in such a way that survivors might not fully participate, might be silenced, or their needs could be minimized, or that it actually could be re-victimizing or traumatic. And then another common concern is that it's too risky for respondents to accept responsibility because they may be putting themselves in a concerning or vulnerable position legally if the behavior that they want to accept responsibility for in a restorative process may also constitute a violation of law. I see Barbara added campus police as a stakeholder. Absolutely. Related to capacity and compliance. That's, I think, both a huge asset and barrier depending on the lens of your law enforcement partners. I'm so glad that you put that up there. Which of these that you see on the screen, if any, do you feel like come up for you most often? Or do you feel like this is it? These are often some of the let's start by looking at these kind of philosophical concerns. Do these arise? And I guess I'd be curious from whom? Where do you see these particular kind of um, buy-in concerns coming up? I wonder whether these are more from the advocacy side or where you see these particular philosophical concerns as opposed to like logistical implementation concerns. Like, we love the idea, but we're not sure how. Anyone want to put into the chat? Yeah, thanks. That it can be perceived as too risky. Yeah. So I will certainly, I think, talk more about how I respond to that. My hope is that we can literally go through each of these barriers and share with each other how we address them and how collectively we can combat some of these barriers. So risk for respondents, you hear more on the logistical side. I appreciate that. Um, yeah, it's so interesting with respect to respondents because you may find that once advisors or attorneys understand what this is, it could actually be very advantageous for respondents. But it depends on whether their advisor or attorney is open to understanding what this is and isn't. With relationship violence, especially for sure. I think there are advocates who worry that the power dynamics may cause more harm. I hear that and feel that as well. Um, and then it's interesting, Jessica, that you're saying I hear more from survivors that they get frustrated that it can't be guaranteed that the respondent participates sincerely. Yeah, so I think this whole idea of like how respondents show up, whether it's risky for them, whether they can fully accept responsibility, whether they're sincere, is really common and worth talking about together. So I love the comments. I appreciate those of you who are chiming in with your thoughts, and we'll keep going on some different strategies that I might use to respond to these. Another one that I hear sometimes, tell me if you all hear this one as well, is like, how do we know it works? So there's a perception that because this feels different than our traditional disciplinary responses, that it is somehow more untested than our traditional retributive justice system. And so I find often that one of the best retorts to this particular concern, although I can go through some of the data that we do have to suggest that actually restorative justice in general can be much more satisfactory for victims than traditional criminal legal systems and even administrative campus systems, which have evidence of being traumatic or re-victimizing, and particularly can be disparate for students of color who report Title IX processes more negatively. But just that in general, so not only, yes, we have a little bit of data that's not very specific to sexual misconduct in higher education in terms of empirical research, but we do have some research on the use of restorative justice with sexual misconduct, namely Mary Koss's seminal study that found positive outcomes that I'm happy to direct folks to, called Project Restore. And then we also just know in general that we have a lot of data suggesting that restorative justice can be a more effective mechanism, not only to increase survivor or victim satisfaction, but also that it can yield better recidivism rates than our traditional systems. Even with all of that context, my primary response is usually that we don't have a lot of data saying that what we're doing now is working. And in fact, we have a lot of data saying the ways in which it isn't. So, namely, our underreporting data really supports the idea that we're actually not meeting most students' needs and that they're not accessing our systems as they are now because they're not designed in a way that would incentivize the acceptance of responsibility or allow survivors to be empowered over the outcome, to have control over the process. And so I think that is a place to start when folks are worried. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about like what are their underlying needs and how do we validate that when someone's asking if it works, it's not because they want to put down this idea because they necessarily think it's some touchy-feely woo-woo hug it out process, though there may be people who think that, but it also may be because there are just people who sincerely want to make sure that we are responding in ways that are effective. And so they may be curious about how do we know that this works? And the answer is also that there is not a single process, including restorative justice, that is appropriate or effective in every situation. And so we would talk more with that person about how do we know when it's the right fit and what does it mean to introduce an additional option and that it's voluntary. So we'll go through some of that. Thank you, as Barbara just said. Yes, explaining the voluntary option, I think that's so critical. So, what are we thinking about when we talk about building buy-in? I want to talk about a number of strategies, and I want to start by just acknowledging that we actually really start with listening. When we build buy-in, why we sort of start by centering the resistance and why I asked you all to name the parties whose buy-in you want and in what form you need or want that buy-in is because we really want to understand with each of those constituents what matters to them. What do they worry about? What do they value? What do they want out of a process? And that allows us to tailor our response to their unique needs, to hear and really understand that the attorney's liability concerns are legitimate. And rather than perceiving that as them wanting to minimize liability to minimize the behavior, it actually is understandable that their job is to minimize liability, not just for the institution, but for you as an individual practitioner in that system. And so, how do we collaborate to say what is the real concern for them? How do we make sure we're doing this in a way that's compliant? And those are some of the examples that we'll talk through as we think about lawyers and students and what their needs are. But really, we start with listening and really wanting to hear and understand what matters to people. And then we're going to talk through some different strategies for buy-in. I want this to feel, as I said in the beginning, really practical, and that those of you on campus are leaving with kind of a template for what you could do to expand this and to pique interest. And the first is awareness raising. So, what are the things that we need to do to debunk some of those misperceptions? How do we start to clarify what restorative justice is and is not? We will take a look at that. And then let's talk a little more specifically with respect to sexual violence prevention and response about relationship building and what are some effective strategies when it comes to wanting to put in place a restorative process and needing to navigate those relationships on campus. For folks who said that the logistical pieces are the ones that are coming up most, I think that's kind of a great position to be in. It means you don't have to make the philosophical argument for why this is valuable. It means that we have to think strategically about then how do we build capacity. So we'll talk about what that could look like, especially on campuses with limited resources, which is nearly everyone. And then lastly, this idea of just what is the problem solving that we're trying to do and how do we make this sustainable? What are some ways in which you can collaborate with others to build buy-in, not in isolation. In part because just so much of this is about individual people who are invested in this work. And in my experience, what can happen then is when those individual people, those champions, as they are referred to in work by Sheila McMahon and Karen Williamson and some folks who have looked at those early adopters of restorative practices. When they talk about champions, those are the people, those might be you. Those might be the people who feel like, I love this, I buy into this, I believe in this. And when they leave, it can be hard for them to see that work sustained on their campuses. So let's clarify what restorative justice is and is not. I know some of these elements have come up in the chat, and I want to just reiterate them because, again, you will get this PowerPoint and then you can use it as hopefully a bit of a guide to navigate some of these conversations when people maybe don't understand fully what it is. And the first is that it is voluntary. It's never a process that someone, when we talked about survivors, might feel coerced into being a part of it. It's essential that when offering any kind of voluntary, adaptable resolution, whether it's restorative justice or a different process, that we are truly gauging whether it's voluntary. And that when students, for example, say that they might want this because they, quote, don't want to ruin someone's life, right? That they say, I don't want to get them in trouble, but I want them to understand how this impacted me. One of the things that I think is so important is that we're tasked with understanding whether, in fact, they do want to see a particular outcome, like that student no longer being in school, but they don't want to be responsible for it, versus they actually don't want them to leave and they want them to have an opportunity to remain in school, learn how to not do this again. So when we say that it's voluntary, it is incumbent on the institution to really understand what that looks like. And one of the ways in which we do that is to be trauma informed and to pair them with appropriate advisors and advocates who are aligned with them and are not perceived or accurately multi-partial, but really can center their needs and be ideally a confidential sounding board for them to identify what they would really want and need moving forward. They're power conscious. So I know there was the study yesterday shared about a study led by Chris Linder at the University of Utah. And her work really, I think, has been helpful for me and for many folks I know about thinking of this idea of sexual violence and intersectionality as not being one in which we can ever do this work in ways that are kind of balancing the power dynamics. Those power dynamics are ever present. And rather than thinking we can necessarily eliminate them in a restorative process, we're actually obligated to think about how they show up in our restorative processes and to respond appropriately. And that might mean not physically bringing parties together if there is an issue of, quote, sincerity, as someone said, if there is a risk of victim blaming, if in our work to prepare parties to come together, we don't think that a responsible party can show up for a harmed party in the way that they need to, then there might be a restorative process that doesn't involve bringing them together physically. And it might be that a restorative process is not appropriate at all. So there's a great degree of sort of assessing that level of accountability and responsibility taking that someone is doing. One of the things that I love about restorative processes when people say that they think that this is a lesser form of accountability, and again, I warned you I was going to use my triangle a lot, is that it's not a lesser form of accountability. It basically says not only will the community, quote, hold you accountable, but we're asking students to hold themselves accountable and to be actively participatory in identifying and carrying out what they need to do to make it right to the impacted party and to the community. So that's very different, I think, than just being sanctioned. And I think when we run into the risk of suggesting that it's more effective to just receive your punishment and never have to accept responsibility or actively make things right, then we really do a disservice to what restorative justice is and can be. So we're talking about mutually agreed upon outcomes for the responsible student, meaning that the parties have equal control over the outcome. But what really makes this process what it is that it's centered on the role differentiation that makes it different from mediation. So when folks, and then I'll come back to the status change italicized section there, when folks express concern, in my opinion, appropriately about this being a form of mediation for sexual violence, one of the reasons that mediation is not appropriate in these cases is because it presumes a level of mutuality, or potentially that the outcome might require something of everyone, and that even if it's collaboration and not compromise, it doesn't have the same role differentiation that this model of restorative justice that I'm talking about has. And so when we reach those mutually agreed upon outcomes for a responsible student through a restorative process, it can involve stepping away from school. It can involve losing a leadership position. It can involve having to move out of a residence hall. And so the difference is that when we talk about reintegration, we're not saying they always remain in the same community. People can lose their right to be in the community, and they can be unsafe to be in the community. The difference is that they are voluntarily stepping into that change, contingent on also taking steps to make things right, or to enter into a treatment program or undergo an assessment, as opposed to just receiving a suspension where they may come back and there has been no accountability, or there's really, if it's an expulsion, no incentive to ever engage in treatment, versus the way in which we can invite people into their own accountability. And it's not rewarding them for engaging in the behavior, it's rewarding them for taking steps to be safe and to address what happened or to repair harm to someone. So a couple more pieces about clarifying what it is and is not, and then we'll start to get into additional strategies to build buy-in. So we want people to understand that it's safety focused and that it's not a replacement for that intervention that I was talking about. And I think that's really important, because sometimes I hear that this is like they're just going to sit down and talk it out, or that what a survivor most wants is for the person who harmed them to understand the impact that it had on them. Even if that's what they most want out of it, it is commonly insufficient to imagine that just that conversation would pair the student with the appropriate resources to make all the kinds of decisions moving forward that they need to make, or to truly better understand what contributed to what they did anyway. It may help them understand the impact that they had, but typically the center of a restorative process might be a dialogue. There's a lot that happens before parties would ever come together, and there's a lot that needs to happen after parties come together, much like what we might think of as sanctions. So if someone isn't fully understanding the magnitude of their behavior at the point of the process, that's actually not uncommon, because it may not be until they go through either the dialogue or the shuttle facilitation, that process itself, that it deepens their understanding. And it may not be until they engage in a whole host of outcomes as a process designed to deepen their understanding or develop skills or those protective factors that they don't have in place. It does not always mean physically bringing them together. And it may be centered around a dialogue. It may be centered around creating an agreement, and it may be both. So it really depends on the needs of the parties. That's what impacts what the process looks like, including what the community brings. So that if we had a case in which a student, a harmed party, all they want out of the process is for a responsible party not to have contact with them anymore, we as an institution might say, okay, but we think there are other things that need to be done to keep the rest of the campus community safe. So that triangle becomes a really valuable tool to help people understand that what goes into any kind of outcome or process is really dependent on the needs of the parties and the institution, and that it's not a one size fits all. That even when we talk about offering a process, that process is tailored to meet the needs of those parties. So let's move on to what you might be able to do to build buy-in using that awareness. And the first piece that I would recommend, if you have not already done this on campus, is host an overview session. Help people understand what this is and isn't. And on the next slide, I'll give you the bullets of what I would cover in that overview session. I think that just infusing it into prevention education is a resource, ways that we can start to help people familiarize themselves with the language and the pathways. If you have every new student if you're getting in front of them in some capacity to do prevention education, making sure we follow through on not just telling them how to report, but telling them what that process looks like if they did report. So we're going to talk a little bit more about prevention education, targeted outreach, and specific training opportunities in which folks could participate in processes without necessarily being a facilitator. So the first is this high level overview. And for me, when I have an hour in front of a campus to help them understand what this is and isn't, as I regularly feel like I'm doing to just help people high level understand what this is, I want to cover what is restorative justice, how it differs from our traditional retributive justice systems and our traditional conduct processes, and what are those basic principles and values that it centers? What are the things that the parties most often need, and what a process can look like? And the party needs to me is really the heart of an overview session. It's where we help people recognize that when we worry about things like survivor empowerment, one of the things that survivors already often are articulating is a desire to feel heard and seen, to have this not happen again, to understand, have the person understand the impact it had, that there are a lot of needs that are not being met currently that are really central to a restorative response. And as I go through these, I'm going to ask you to put into the chat any thoughts that are coming up for you, or whether you offer any of these so you can connect with each other as well, if you'd like examples of how you all are doing some of these things. The next one is to think about how we embed the restorative option into prevention education. And this is to give context when you're in front of students, or doing mandatory reporting training, to help people understand what students want, including the students who are causing harm, what's preventing them from coming forward, what would it look like if this option was available to them, how they might be able to come forward about their own behavior or concerns about their friend. You want to share data. What are you seeing about that people are coming forward? Once you have this option in place and see hopefully an increase in people accessing it, I think communicating that back to students is really helpful, to not only let them know, yes, you can report in this way, but we actually did have a lot of students come forward this past semester or last year, and then how to access more information on what it looks like to go through one of these processes. That's such a valuable, easy lift, in my opinion, and I'm happy to help share examples where you don't need a whole new policy overhaul. You can do a quick FAQ for students about, if I'm thinking of exploring this restorative process, what would that look like? What do I need to submit in order to get that started? What happens if I don't want the other student to know that I'm coming forward? What happens if they're not interested in the restorative process and I am, or vice versa? What if I'm being invited into a process and I'm not sure it's right for me? Those are the kinds of FAQ documents that can be so helpful to just getting students engaged with what this is and isn't, promoting it on social media, other marketing materials, things that we put on the back of a bathroom stall, encouraging students to know how to contact Title IX, could also say, we offer a restorative option if people are concerned about, quote, getting someone in trouble, or they're worried about confidentiality. I know it was a question that came up. So thinking about what does restorative justice offer that might be of interest to people to at least want more information. And so that confidentiality piece that came up, that is a potential concern, I think it's a really important piece. And what I would suggest, and I have a whole other session on kind of building out your policy and thinking about how you put this into your policy, is that to the extent possible, you offer administrative confidentiality, meaning that restorative processes allow people to share information or talk about what occurred in a way that can't get pulled into an investigation or hearing process. if the restorative process is unsuccessful. With respect to the potential criminal liability or implications, it's important to be transparent with students about where the bounds of your confidentiality begin and end, so that if you want them to know that were you to receive a lawful subpoena, or we adhere to confidentiality to the extent permitted by law, and this is what that looks like. So I think people need to make informed decisions about whether they want to participate. I also think that sometimes they don't say terribly different things in a restorative process than they might say to explain how they perceived an incident when participating in a hearing process. So it's maybe not going to be a fit for someone who doesn't want to speak at all, has been advised not to speak at all, or to engage in any repair. As we shift from awareness raising to relationship building, this is a visual that is from Kay Pranis and colleagues in the world of circles, to really think about the progression that so often on campuses and everywhere we jump to: what's the plan? How do we develop a plan? What are we going to do? Or we have an issue and we need to address it. But in fact, we really can't be effective in developing that plan and understanding those issues until we build some trust and understanding, because folks won't speak with us openly. We won't get to the heart of what matters to them. And we can't build that trust and understanding until we engage in getting acquainted. So this model is designed for the flow of a circle process. Were you to bring parties together and help them to get acquainted with each other, to engage in perhaps rounds and active circle processes that build trust. But it also is just macro a model for where we even are in our ability to implement restorative practices or to put in place this plan of action. And that is because what we're really trying to do is build trust in a process. And we don't build trust in a system or a process. We build trust in people. So it's how we experience the people in that process or who have gone through that process. That's what dictates whether or not people trust us to uphold the process, will access it to begin with. So we're building trust of the people that other people trust. So when we think about building buy-in on campus, we're thinking, who has institutional power, who other people already trust, who has social capital? How do I get the folks who have decision-making ability, not just administratively and positionally, but also socially and with respect to different targeted groups on campus? So when we think about building trust, that's just so fundamental to what leads someone to report to begin with. Before a student would report to you or your institution, what are they going to do? They're going to ask someone else, do you know anyone who's gone through this process? Or do you know the person they would be going to, right? So people are basing their trust in the system on their experience with the people. So we need to do a lot to build relationships. And one of the ways in which we build relationships and true relationships that aren't just manipulative to try to gain approval is to really understand what they want and need and how this process actually can serve them or where we're falling short. So as we think about targeted outreach, we want to think about who are those groups that came up for you on that grid of the different people on your campus that really could be an asset to you, or where kind of those tension points. So if it is administrative approval, if it is increasing utilization, how do we start to target the folks that we need to be enlisting? But then as importantly, we want to ask, who do they trust? Who could I partner with, not just going directly to them and building relationship, but who are the constituents that I already have on campus who I think do buy into this? And understanding that difference between the philosophical hesitations that we talked about and the logistical ones. So as we move into the logistical piece, which is kind of our last component, and then hopefully we'll have a couple minutes for any questions that might be coming up for you all. We are really thinking about capacity building and compliance as well. Let me go through compliance first, and then we'll talk about capacity building. We need to know our stuff in terms of how this fits into our very kind of structured compliance climate. We have obligations through Clery, we have obligations through Title IX, we have state laws that impact things in Maryland, in California, in states where it feels like there are specific restrictions impacting how we use informal resolution or certain types of informal resolution in sexual misconduct cases or certain types of sexual misconduct cases. If that's the case in one of your states, it's really important to understand where California, for example, the language is a prohibition on mediation, then we're in a matter of making people understand the difference between mediation and restorative justice. We know there are limitations on being able to use an informal resolution when an employee is alleged to have harassed a student if it falls under Title IX. So really understanding where it's permitted and where it isn't will help us in making an argument for why it can be a valuable option if we can understand where we recognize it is not doable and that there is very specific language allowing it. And so being able to point to that and say, in fact, right here is where it explicitly says that it is an option, that it cannot be a requirement, however, and here are the conditions when we offer it. So I had put, I think, into the Whova app, I uploaded a couple resources that I had the opportunity to create with the Victim Rights Law Center. And so if you're interested in those and learning more, it was a way to try to be able to say, what are those compliance considerations when we are developing and implementing an informal resolution process? What do we need to make sure we have in place? So, last piece. Hopefully, you're still with me. I'm going to ask you what you're having for dinner if you're not with me. Okay, capacity building. So, assess our in-house and community experience and expertise, really. Do you have folks regionally? Some people said we have community partners who are RJ practitioners. So, how do we partner with them, whether it's to provide training or to potentially even collaborate on direct service to individuals? How do we create those collaborations, not just for RJ practitioners to support sustainability, but what I really mean by that is like a committee or an office. We can't always hire someone, but we could create a collaborative. We could create an institutional commitment to restorative justice that perhaps even goes beyond its use for sexual harm. And you'll see the next item up there is build trust in the process for other kinds of harms. It's hard to make the argument or to introduce what this is and could look like in the most serious cases, though in fact it can be most impactful in the most serious cases. But to help people understand what it is and what it could look like, use it for theft from the bookstore, use it for issues in residence halls that impact communities, demonstrate its effectiveness and build a familiarity. Of course, accessing training, which I recognize takes resources, but there are free trainings as well that you can direct folks to or engage in yourselves. Review adaptable resolution options in your policy. So it's a little chicken and egg. Sometimes people will say, we don't have a ton in our policy. Do we need that before we offer this? I think, we want to build the capacity before we say that it's an option, but we also need to say that it's an option for people to be able to access it and to make sure that when anyone says, well, you don't even have an informal resolution process, that it's built out and transparent about what is available. And then there was some concern, understandably, about time. How much time does this take? Or we can't take on like one new thing. And so this is not always about adding something. This can also be an approach or a set of tools to be used in our existing work with students. And so the other piece to that, I guess, is that our current systems, our investigation and hearing models, take a considerable amount of time. They're enormously time consuming. And so to suggest that this approach in and of itself takes more time, it actually doesn't, in my experience. It's a repurposing of our time. And so our last slide, and then I know we have, thank you, Brittany's messaging me. We have 5 more minutes. I think we're right on schedule to leave a minute or two for questions. Is that I love a good community member training. So maybe you don't have the capacity currently, nor are you going to have a bunch of facilitators on campus, although that may be a model that you want to build out to have more than just you. If you, for example, or your colleagues in conduct or Title IX have this skill set. But think about how you could train community members who are trained community members to represent the needs of community, not even necessarily physically in circle, but you may find, for example, I've used community members or surrogate victims in like a sexual harassment circle where the victims didn't want to sit down with the responsible party, but they wanted this individual to understand how they had impacted people. And so we used this trained community representative, a student who could articulate the broader harm, who could weigh in on what was needed for repair. You want folks who have a familiarity with the resources that are available. So in this case, it was a sexual violence peer educator. You want someone who can provide reintegration support. Sometimes there are community representatives who might be able to say to a responsible party, come meet with me. There are schools that are using like a mentorship model where one of the outcomes is that I just met with a school yesterday where one of the outcomes is often that a student might have to meet monthly with a coach or a faculty member to also kind of help them stay on the right track depending on the situation, as one element of many things that they're doing. I am going to put my information up here, and you'll see here that it talks about some next steps for you. If you're interested when you have this, you can reflect on whose buy-in do I need? How do I want to engage leadership? Where are we now? Where do we want to go next? How might I plan training? How do I educate the community? So I left very little time, but you put some thoughts in there earlier, so I'm going to pause if anyone wants to add anything else.
And Rachel, did you see the question in the Q&A? I can read it out if not.
That'd be
From
great.
Barbara.
Thanks.
All right, it says, hi, Rachel. I'm interested in learning how to best support a victim survivor or a person who caused harm if they decide at any point to step back from the restorative justice process. How do we support them, especially if they feel and express how disappointed after investing so much preparation and hope in the process, and support any support recommendations?
Great question. And the first thing that I would say is that that's actually really common, and that to let them know that this is not a linear process, and that idea that people may have their needs shift along the way is totally normal. And if the process helped them better determine what they want and need, and that landed them in a place of realizing what they thought in the beginning was not what they want and need, that's okay. That's not a failure of the process. If we're hearing them and we're able to do whatever they need as a next step, and that might include stepping away from a restorative process, that has happened to me. Sometimes they step back in at a later date. Sometimes they don't, and that's okay. And sometimes it's not right for them at all because the finding of responsibility and the outcome they hope for in a traditional process is of importance to them in a way that this process may not offer. Great question. Other questions? I'd love to do a little checkout if anyone's willing to put into the chat anything that you're taking from this session that feels helpful to being able to build buy-in on campus. And I offer myself to continue these conversations. I clearly love talking about these things, so I hope that you won't hesitate to reach out to me if you want to talk more. Anyone want to do a quick checkout? Indulge me. Anything here that you feel like you can use to build buy-in? And I know we're at time. Love the restorative triangle. Thanks. Me too. It's a really helpful tool for me. Awesome. I see the evaluation link. So thank you for putting that in there. And I will respect your time, and thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Sorry, my kid in the background. Thank you so much. And everybody, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. And we will hopefully see you tomorrow for our last day.
Thanks, Bridget.